They threw her out of the operating room before she could even wash her hands. "You don't belong in here." The man's voice bounced off the tile walls, loud enough for every nurse and resident in the room to hear. "I don't know who let you through that door, but this is a sterile environment, not a public hallway." Dr. Serena Voss, 34 years old, black, 5'3" in compression socks, wearing a gray zip-up hoodie over her scrubs because the hospital's HVAC had been broken for 6 weeks, stood perfectly still in the doorway of OR4 at Caldwell Memorial Medical Center. She looked at the man who had just spoken, Dr. Mitchell Crane, chief of cardiac surgery, 51 years old. The kind of white man who wore his authority the way other people wear cologne, pervasive, uninvited, and convinced everyone around him was grateful for the exposure. "I said get out." He didn't look up from the instrument tray he was reviewing and tell the charge nurse to stop letting hospital volunteers wander into surgical suites. Serena said nothing. Not yet. She stepped back, let the door swing shut, stood in the corridor under the fluorescent lights, with her access badge clipped to her chest, her name printed in clean black letters, and a grant approval letter folded in the breast pocket of her hoodie that represented $4.3 million of federal funding and the reason she was standing in this building at all. She could have said something right then. She didn't. But let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start in that operating room. It starts 3 time zones away in a rainstorm, in a parking garage, on a Tuesday morning when Serena Voss, who was already running 12 minutes late, didn't care even a little bit. Seattle, February. The kind of wet that gets inside your collar no matter what you're wearing. Serena pulled her 10-year-old Civic into the parking structure at Cascade General Hospital at 7:22 a.m. She'd driven 4 hours from Portland because her connecting flight had been canceled, and she hadn't slept more than 3 hours in the last 36. She had a folder of research data on the passenger seat, a thermos of cold coffee, and a meeting with the hospital's executive committee in 98 minutes. She looked like someone's college-age daughter dropping by to see where mom worked. That was the thing about Serena. She didn't perform her credentials. No designer bag, no power blazer. She wore what she wore because she'd been operating on cardiac patients until midnight and had driven through the night because the work didn't stop when she was tired. What Caldwell Memorial's executive committee didn't fully know yet. What most people in any room she entered didn't know until she told them, or until someone else did, was that Serena Voss had published 11 peer-reviewed papers on minimally invasive cardiac repair techniques, had been awarded the Harrington Medal for Surgical Innovation, 2 years running, and had just been appointed as the youngest lead investigator in the NIH's Cardiac Repair Initiative in the program's 40-year history. She also held a patent on a surgical instrument that was currently used in 63 hospitals across 9 countries. None of that was visible from the parking garage. She signed in at the visitor's desk. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Gloria, glanced at the zip-up hoodie, the damp ponytail, the worn sneakers, and typed something into her computer with the slow deliberateness of someone who wasn't entirely convinced the visit was legitimate. "And you're here to see the executive committee. I have a 9 o'clock with Dr. Harlan Briggs." Serena set her folder on the counter. "I'm Dr. Voss." Gloria looked at the folder, looked at Serena, looked back at her computer. One moment. It took 4 minutes to confirm the appointment that had been on the hospital's calendar for 6 weeks. Serena waited without sighing, without checking her phone, without doing anything that might be read as impatience. She'd been through this particular version of the conversation enough times to know how it went. She got her visitor badge. She found the elevator. She went up to the 4th floor to wait. Harlan Briggs was 58, the hospital's chief medical officer, the kind of administrator who'd spent so long on the executive side that he'd started talking about patients the way accountants talk about line items. He was warm enough in a boardroom, competent in the way of men who've been promoted slowly and steadily for 30 years, and never had reason to question why. He greeted Serena at the conference room door with a handshake and a look that lasted half a second too long. The look that said he'd been told she was coming but hadn't quite pictured this. "Dr. Voss, welcome. Can I get you anything?" "Coffee? I'm fine, thank you." She sat. She opened her folder. She walked the committee through her research proposal in 42 minutes without notes, without filler words, without a single moment of the apologetic hedging that young female researchers were often pushed toward in rooms full of older men in expensive watches. She was precise. She was devastating. She answered every question before it was fully formed. By the time she finished, 3 of the 5 committee members were leaning forward. One was already writing something down. Mitchell Crane was the 5th. He sat at the end of the table with his arms crossed, and the practiced boredom of a man who decided his opinion before anyone in the room opened their mouth. He was the only one who hadn't looked at her research packet, the only one who hadn't written anything down. When the room opened for questions, he spoke first. I have to be honest. He tapped the table once with 2 fingers, casual, dismissive. "I'm not sure what we're looking at here. This is a research grant, not a surgical appointment. We'd be bringing in an outside investigator to work in our ORs with our staff using our resources. And I'm not clear on what Cascade General actually gets out of this arrangement." Serena looked at him. $4.3 million in federal funding direct to this institution, full access to our published protocols, co-authorship credit on all resulting research, and a first-look license option on any patentable outcomes. Crane blinked. "Once, right, yes. But practically speaking, who supervises the work? Who vouches for the methodology? These are our surgical suites. We have liability considerations. The NIH oversees all methodology. My team's credentials are in the packet in front of you." She paused. Page 7. Crane hadn't opened the packet. The committee voted 4-1 to approve the partnership. Crane abstained, which in the architecture of that particular room meant no. Serena thanked everyone, shook hands, and walked back to the elevator alone. She was back 3 weeks later. Permanent badge. Assigned workspace on the 3rd floor. A locker in the surgical wing. From the first day, Crane made the geometry of her presence in that hospital into something that required constant negotiation. He didn't do it with anything you could put in a report. He did it the way people do when they've learned to work, just under the threshold of accountability. He questioned her protocol choices in front of residents, framing it as just asking. He forwarded her emails to other department heads with notes that said things like flagging for awareness. He described her work in meetings as the NIH project instead of her name. He never once called her Dr. Voss in front of his own staff. His people followed the signal he sent. Nurses who worked his cases were slower to respond to her requests. The OR scheduling coordinator, a man named Todd Fenwick, repeatedly moved her reserved surgical observation slots to accommodate Crane's elective procedures. When Serena raised it with the scheduling office, Todd told her the OR calendar was subject to priority designation by attending physicians. She filed a note. She documented. She kept working. 3 weeks in, she was observing a valve repair from the gallery, gloved, badged, in the exact seat she'd been assigned through the exact approval process the hospital required. When Crane looked up from the table, saw her through the glass, and sent a scrub tech to tell her the gallery was closed for procedural review. The gallery had been occupied by 4 residents 5 minutes earlier. She walked out, went to her workspace, and sent an email to the Chief of Staff's office requesting clarification on gallery access policy. She CC'd her NIH program liaison. She kept her language factual, specific, and completely free of adjectives. The clarification never came. What came instead was the morning in OR4. It was a Friday, 6 weeks into her residency at the hospital. Serena had been given explicit written authorization, signed by Harlan Briggs himself, to observe and assist on a series of cardiac procedures relevant to her research. That morning's case, a septal defect repair on a 41-year-old schoolteacher named Paul Witten, was on her approved list. She'd been standing in the doorway for less than 10 seconds before Crane told her to get out. She stood in the corridor afterward, let the door close, held her badge in her hand and looked at it for a moment. Then she walked to the end of the hall, found a chair near the window, sat down, and called her colleague, Dr. James Okonkwo. He picked up on the first ring. They just removed me from the observation on the Witten case. James was quiet for a second. Crane? Who else? You have the written authorization. I have everything. Then we're not doing this quietly anymore, James said. You've given them 6 weeks of documented pattern. That's enough. Serena looked out the window. The parking lot was gray under February clouds. A transport van pulled up to the ER entrance below. She watched an orderly hold the door open for a patient in a wheelchair. I know, she said. She hung up. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't call the NIH liaison. Not yet. She called her mother. Her mother, Eleanor Voss, picked up on the third ring in the middle of making breakfast in a small house in Decatur, Georgia. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she said, "Baby, you didn't go all the way up there to be quiet." Serena smiled. "No, I didn't." She went to Harlan Briggs's office at 11:15 that morning. She did not have an appointment. She walked past his assistant, a young man named Brendan who started to say something and then saw her face and stopped, and opened the door. Briggs looked up from his desk, startled. "Dr. Voss, I want to show you something." She set the folder on his desk. This is a documented log of 17 incidents over the past 6 weeks. Unauthorized removal from approved observation assignments. Exclusion from case briefings I was designated to attend. Email correspondence showing a pattern of administrative obstruction originating from Dr. Crane's office. Gallery access revoked after my presence was reported to him. She set a second document on top of the first. This is my authorization letter, your signature. Page 2. Briggs looked at the folder. He looked at Serena. He had the expression of a man who'd been carefully not knowing something for a very long time and had just been handed proof that his not knowing had a cost. "Dr. Voss, I want you to know that we take these. I'm not finished." Her voice was the same volume it had been since she walked in. Steady, unhurried. This research partnership represents $4.3 million to this institution. It also represents the first hospital-based study of this kind in the Pacific Northwest. The NIH considers this a flagship program. There are 3 other institutions that submitted competing proposals. They were not selected. She let that land. If I leave or if I'm forced out, that funding goes with me to whichever institution I go to next. That's not a threat. That's how federal research partnerships work. I want to make sure we have a shared understanding of the situation before you tell me what you're going to do. Briggs sat back in his chair. The leather exhaled under him. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He looked at the folder. He pressed his fingers together the way men do when they're rapidly recalculating something they thought they already understood. "I'll need to speak with Dr. Crane," he said finally. "Of course. I'll leave the documentation with you." She straightened her jacket. "I'll be in my workspace." She walked out. She closed the door behind her the way she always did, gently, without drama, without a single unnecessary movement. Mitchell Crane was called into Harlan Briggs's office at 1:30 that afternoon. He went in with the confidence of a man who'd been running that surgical wing for 11 years and had always known, that his name on the door meant something. He came out 40 minutes later a different man. Not visibly. Crane wasn't the kind of person whose face betrayed him easily. But something behind his eyes had shifted. The particular quality of certainty that had defined his posture every time he walked through that building was gone, replaced by something more careful, more watchful. Like a man who'd just learned there was a camera he hadn't known about. What happened in that room took 2 days to reach Serena fully, piece by piece. Briggs had called the NIH program director himself, a woman named Dr. Constance Bird, who had overseen Serena's work for 4 years and had 0 patience for what she called institutional friction. Constance had been pleasant. She had also been exceptionally clear. She used the phrase funding reconsideration once, without raising her voice, and Briggs had reportedly not spoken for several seconds. After that call, Briggs had called Crane back in. That conversation, by Brendan's careful reconstruction, pieced together from the hallway, a partially open door and 30 years of reading rooms he technically wasn't supposed to be reading, involved Briggs using the words pattern of conduct, documented evidence, liability exposure, and I need you to explain to me exactly what you thought you were doing. Crane had no good answer. He had the kind of answers that sound like explanations until you hold them next to the evidence, and then they don't sound like anything at all. By the following Monday, 3 things had happened. First, Todd Fenwick, the OR scheduling coordinator who had been bumping Serena's reservations for 6 weeks, was reassigned to the outpatient administrative office on the first floor. His replacement, a woman named Marlene, who had worked in surgical scheduling at 2 other institutions and had a reputation for running a clean calendar, started the same day. Second, an institutional memo went out from Briggs's office to all department heads at Cascade General. It outlined the hospital's research partnership protocols and made clear that visiting investigators with NIH authorization were to be treated with the same professional deference extended to any attending physician. The memo didn't mention Serena by name. It didn't have to. Third, Mitchell Crane submitted a written apology to Serena Voss. It was 3 sentences long, formal, bloodless. The kind of apology that a lawyer helps you write so it acknowledges the shape of what happened without admitting the soul of it. Serena read it once, folded it, put it in her folder with everything else. She didn't respond. The Witten case, the septal defect repair she'd been excluded from, was rescheduled for the following week. She observed from the gallery this time. No one came to move her. She stood at the glass with her notepad and watched the surgical team work, making notes in the clean, economical handwriting she'd had since medical school. It was a good repair. Even Crane's technique, she could admit privately, was solid. He was a skilled surgeon. That had never been the question. Afterward, she was in the corridor when Paul Witten's wife, a small woman in her 50s named Helen, who'd been waiting in the family room for 4 hours, came rushing out when the team emerged. Serena watched from a few feet away as the attending told Helen that her husband was out of surgery, that it had gone well, that he'd be in recovery soon. Helen put her face in both hands, not crying, just breathing into her palms for a second, taking in the news, letting the fear she'd been carrying all morning release somewhere private. Serena looked away to give her that moment. Then Helen looked up, and her eyes landed on Serena. She didn't know who Serena was, didn't know anything about the grant or the research or the weeks of friction that had preceded that morning. She just saw a woman in a gray zip-up hoodie standing in the hallway, and something in Serena's face, some quality of stillness, made her walk over. "Is he okay?" Helen asked. "They said he's okay. He is," Serena said. "The repair went well." Helen nodded, exhaled. "Thank you." She didn't even know why she was saying it to this particular woman. She just needed to say it to someone. "Of course," Serena said. The research continued for 11 months. The data was exceptional. Serena knew it was exceptional 3 months before the analysis was finished. In the way you know something when the numbers are lining up in directions you'd hoped for, but hadn't let yourself count on. Her minimally invasive technique showed a 34% reduction in post-operative recovery time across their patient cohort. Complication rates were lower than the national average for comparable procedures. The surgical team that had trained under her protocol had adopted it with a speed that surprised even her. The results went to the NIH in November. By January, Dr. Constance Bird called to tell her the findings were being fast-tracked for publication in the New England Journal of Medicine. Pending peer review, they published in April. The story, the research, the technique, the outcomes, was picked up by the Associated Press the week the journal issue dropped. Within 48 hours, it was in every major medical news outlet in the country and a significant portion of the international press. The headline on the Wire story was simple: Young surgeons' technique could redefine cardiac recovery standards. By the end of that week, Cascade General's communications office had received 200 media inquiries. Briggs held a press conference. He said the word partnership 14 times. He said Serena's name with the particular warmth of someone who wanted to be understood as having always believed in her. She let him. Crane was not at the press conference. 6 months after publication, Serena was back at Cascade General for a follow-up research session. She walked through the parking garage in a gray hoodie, same as always. She signed in at the front desk. Gloria looked up from her computer, recognized her immediately, and said, "Good morning, Dr. Voss," before Serena had taken her badge out of her pocket. "Good morning, Gloria." She went up to the 4th floor. She stopped by the OR scheduling office and said hello to Marlene. She passed a cluster of residents in the hallway. 3 young women, one of whom had clearly just started her surgical rotation, based on the way she was clutching her reference card, and one of them looked up and did a small, involuntary double-take. The recognizing kind. Serena gave her a nod. The resident nodded back, a little too fast, like she was trying not to seem like she'd recognized someone. Serena kept walking. She went to OR 4. She pushed the door open. She walked in and began washing her hands at the scrub sink, methodical, elbow to fingertip, 30 seconds each side. No one told her she didn't belong there. The scrub nurse handed her a gown. The resident setting up the instrument tray said good morning. The attending on today's case, not Crane, a younger surgeon named Dr. Felicity Park, who'd been trained on Serena's protocol, looked up and said, "Dr. Voss, good to have you." "Thank you," Serena said. She turned to face the room. The overhead light was bright and steady above the table. The instruments were laid out clean and precise. Through the gallery glass above her, she could see 3 medical students waiting to observe. Everything was exactly as it should be. She exhaled slowly, quietly, and she went to work. "I want to ask you something before you go." When Serena was standing in that hallway, badge on her chest, authorization letter in her pocket, after being told to get out of a room she had every right to be in, she didn't yell, she didn't cry. She didn't do anything that would let anyone in that building feel justified in what they'd done. She documented, she gathered, she made one call to the right person at the right time, and she let the weight of what she'd already built do the rest of the work. Most people don't have a $4 million grant in their back pocket. Most people don't have the NIH on speed dial. And I know that. Serena knew that. She said it herself in the only interview she gave about what had happened at Cascade General. She said the outcomes she was able to demand were the outcomes she was only able to demand because of the position she was in, and that the exact same thing had happened to doctors and nurses and technicians and researchers who didn't have that position, who had just as much right to be in those rooms, who walked out of buildings they deserved to be in and had no institutional leverage to walk back. She said, "I know what changed here. What I'm still not sure of is what it's going to take to change the part that shouldn't depend on me. That's the part I want you to sit with. Because somewhere right now, there's someone standing in a hallway they belong in, being told they don't. And they have no patent, no federal grant, no Constance Bird to call. They have nothing except the truth of why they're there. What happens to them?" Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you angry or proud or both at the same time, share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear it today. Like and subscribe if you want more stories like this. We tell them every week on this channel, and I'm not stopping anytime soon. Because these stories matter, and so do the people in them.